There's a pink sheet in your bulletin, and you're welcome to follow along with me. So contrary to what many people think, Easter, as I said in my opening remarks, it doesn't just celebrate a single day in a calendar year. In the case of this year, it doesn't just celebrate what happened Sunday, March 27th. Easter is a season. It's a season in the life of the church that begins on Easter Sunday and continues for 7 full weeks, right through to Pentecost Sunday. And so this 7-week period, known as the Great 50 Days, or the Week of Weeks, is a time in which we not only celebrate the power of resurrection, but also God's ability to make all things new. God's ability to make you new. Your life, your faith, your relationships. And so for the past 6 weeks, we've been looking at how we can live this reality out in our everyday lives, how we can be Easter people, how we can live more fully the resurrection life that Jesus won for us. And so just to quickly review, so far we have looked at the life of abundance. Jesus said, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. We looked at the life of liberty, how we can do more of the things that God calls us to do and that we want to do, and less of those things within us that we don't want to do. And we looked at the life of security, how Jesus is our good shepherd. Last week, if you were here, we looked at scenes from the life of the Apostle Peter, and how through Jesus' resurrection, God offers each one of us, just like he did Peter, restoration. And how nothing is beyond God's power to redeem and to restore. This morning we continue then by looking at another facet of the resurrection life, and that is a life of faith. A life of faith. I want to begin by looking at something that I know every single one of us has struggled with at some point in our lives, and that is fear. If you've ever struggled with fear, just put up your hand. Okay, it's all of us. I mean, what are you afraid of? Think of that for a minute. Are you afraid of, are you terrified by creepy crawlies? Are you scared of slithering serpents? Do the things with more than 4 legs cause you to scream like a schoolgirl? If you've answered yes to any one of those questions, you're not alone. According to the National Institute of Mental Health in the U.S., and I suspect it would be the same for Canada, phobias affect approximately 10% of adults. Now, personally, I would have thought that was higher, but there you go. One website lists 386 of the most common phobias, which typically involve the environment, animals, or specific life situations. So let me share with you the top 10, and maybe you can relate to some of these. Number 1 is arachnophobia. What is that? Fear of spiders. That's right. The next one is ophidiophobia. What am I afraid of, Kate? Snakes. Ophidiophobia, the fear of snakes. Agoraphobia. Right, the fear of outdoor spaces, sometimes public spaces or crowded areas. Acrophobia. The fear of heights, that's right. Cynophobia, with a C, cynophobia, the fear of dogs. Astrophobia, that is the fear of thunder and lightning. We had a dog that suffered from that once. Trypanophobia, the fear of injections. Then there are various social phobias, which is a general category of just fear of certain social situations. I'm sure we all have our own of those. The next one is pteromerhanophobia. Pteromerhanophobia. It's the fear of flying. Anyone have a fear of flying? And finally, number 10, mysophobia. And that's not the fear of mice. Mysophobia, the fear of germs or dirt. And of course, I think we could add to that triskaidekaphobia, the fear of the number 13. But think about it. What phobias or fears do you have? Did you connect with any of those on that list? I did. More than one, let me tell you. But regardless of what it is, we can classify, I think, our fears into two basic groups or types. They're either external fears or internal fears. Now, external fears are those things that come at us from the outside that we're afraid of, like snakes or spiders or germs. Internal fears are a bit more tricky. Internal fears are those fears that reside within us, in our hearts or in our minds. And although these internal fears may not look as real as a snake or a shark, they affect us more often than we think because we always have them with us, right? They're always there. We take them wherever we go into our everyday lives. And these internal fears are the uncertainties, rational or irrational, that we have within ourselves. Fears like, do I really matter? Or do I have what it takes? Or am I going to make a fool of myself in this situation? I suspect that this list, this last one, am I going to make a fool of myself in this situation, is the reason why many surveys show that the number one internal fear that people have is fear of public speaking. Number one internal fear, done at least through surveys and polls, is that fear of standing up in front of other people and speaking. Now, incidentally, the number two internal fear is death. So if you take those and if you think about it, that means that at a funeral, most people would rather be in the box than giving the eulogy. But whatever it is, whether it is external or internal, whether it's staring us right in the face or somewhere off in the background, whether it's large or small, whether it's real or imagined, irrational or rational, fear can paralyze us, can it? It paralyzes us. It can keep us from acting. It can keep us from living our lives to the fullness. It can steal our joy. It can rob our hope. And in the face of fear, we generally do one of three things. Number one, we run. Literally. Right? You should see me at Lemoyne's Point when I see one of those huge anaconda snakes stretched across the path, sunning itself. I'm out of there. And I know my father-in-law says they're just garter snakes. But those things can eat you too, right? Those little garter snakes? No. Okay. Well, so number one is we run. Number two is denial, right? So we pretend it's not there, and we avoid it at all costs. We refuse to talk about our fear with anyone. We refuse to go get help, we just push it down, and we soldier on. And number three is control. And by that I mean we try to control the world around us. We try to control everything and everyone to protect ourselves from our fears. And this is especially true of those internal fears and those insecurities and uncertainties. If I can control you, then I don't have to worry about that stuff that's living in me. Now, as you might expect, none of these responses are particularly helpful. Jesus did not lay down his life. He did not die on the cross so that we could live our lives enslaved to fear. Jesus died and was raised again so that we could live a life of faith, not fear. The life that we were meant to live from the very beginning, the life that he wants to give us. Instead of running away, instead of denial or control, God has a different way for us to deal with our fear. He wants us to let go and to trust him. To let go and trust him. Two of the most common phrases in the Bible, Old Testament and New, are fear not and do not be afraid. Isaiah 41 verse 10 reads, "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be afraid, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my victorious right hand." And Psalm 34 verse 6, "I cried out to the Lord in my suffering, and he heard me and set me free from all my fears." So did you catch those? I will uphold you with my victorious right hand. He heard me and set me free from all my fears. Kathy, the next time that we're at Lemoyne's Point and a snake crosses my path, just remind me that God has a victorious right hand. You just remind me of that? But the reality is, when fear controls our life, and when we find ourselves in a situation when we are afraid, it can feel like we're sinking. Right? And we see this image several places in the Bible. Psalm 69 verse 1 reads, "Save me, O God, for the floodwaters are up to my neck. Deeper and deeper I sink into the mire. I can't find a foothold. I am in deep water, and the floods overwhelm me." Can you relate? Have you ever been so afraid, so uncertain? Have you ever felt like the floods were just overwhelming you? You had that sinking feeling. I mean, I've felt that before. And it's in these moments that we need to remember what God says through Psalm 40. David says, "I waited patiently for the Lord to help me, and he turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me up out of the pit of despair, out of the mud and the mire. He set my feet on solid ground and steadied me as I walked along. He has given me a new song to sing, a hymn of praise to our God." This psalm tells us that the best thing that we can do when we're afraid, when we are overwhelmed by the storms of life, when we feel like we're sinking, is to have faith. To wait patiently and to trust that God will lift us up and set us on solid ground. And I think we see this in our reading this morning from the Gospel of Mark that Timothy just read for us. So we looked at this story already, right? We looked at Matthew's version last week when we looked at those snippets from the life of Peter. But I want to look in greater detail this morning in Mark's version. If you have your Bibles with you, you're welcome to open them to Mark chapter 6. But in Mark's version of the story, after feeding the 5,000, right, with 5 loaves and 2 fish, Jesus tells his disciples to get into their boat and to go ahead of them to Bethsaida, to a small town about 2 hours up the coastline, while he went off all by himself to pray. Now things, as we know, did not go according to plan. Verse 45 reads, "Late that night, the disciples were in their boat in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on land. He saw that they were in serious trouble, rowing hard and struggling against the wind and the waves." So I don't know about you, but I read the passage and I think, okay, what were the disciples doing in the middle of the lake in the middle of the night? Miles off course, right? When all they had to do was sail a few miles north up the coastline. I mentioned it briefly last week, but an understanding of the geography of the area can help answer this question. The Sea of Galilee is located in the northern part of Israel, 700 feet below sea level. So the air there is very warm. But at the north end of the sea are the Golan Heights. And the Golan Heights are a very high mountain range on the border of Syria and Lebanon. As a matter of fact, if you go to the Golan and you stand and look over, you can see the trees of Lebanon. It's really a magnificent sight. So what would happen is cold air would blow off these mountains, off the Golan Heights, and straight into the Sea of Galilee. The cold air hitting the warm air, which would cause a sudden and violent storm to whip up over the water. And this happened all the time on the Sea of Galilee. And this is most likely what happened that night. Right? A huge wind blew across the sea. The disciples were caught off guard. They were blown off course. And Mark tells us that the disciples were so overwhelmed with their fear, as you might expect, and as they strained against the wind and the waves to survive, Jesus came to them on the water. And of course, they didn't recognize him because they didn't expect to see Jesus walking on the water. And it's interesting that Mark says he was going to pass them by. He was just going to pass them by, but he saw that they were afraid, and so he called out to them. He came to them, he got into the boat, and we're told that the storm subsided. Now this story, I think, identifies 5 common signs of fear that can help us know when we are overwhelmed and sinking. 5 signs. Sign number 1 is we can't see our way. We can't see our way. John's version of this story reads, by now it was dark. Right? When we're sinking, when we are overwhelmed by fear or uncertainty, we can't see. Right? We lack clarity. We lack vision. Right? We get lost and confused. We don't know which way to turn. We don't know what way forward. That's sign number one. Sign number two is we feel alone. Again, John's version says Jesus had not yet joined them. The disciples were alone in a small boat against a violent storm. And similarly, when we're afraid, we can sometimes feel like we're all alone. That there's no one that we can depend on for help. That God is not with us. Sign number three, we're outside of our comfort zone. Right? Mark tells us that the disciples ended up in the middle of the lake, far from the safety of the shore. And we can experience this same sinking feeling when we find ourselves in deep water. When we find ourselves over our head, things over our head or outside of our comfort zone. Sign number four, strong forces are against us. Strong forces are against us. Mark 6 verse 48 reads, the wind was against them. And John's version, the waters were rough. Now the Greek word here for rough is megas. Megas. In other words, it was a mega storm with mega wind and mega waves. And we can feel like we're sinking when we are hit by the mega storms of life, whatever form that storm might take. And finally, sign number 5 is we're struggling and we're failing. Right? It's not like the disciples were struggling in the boat and they were getting somewhere. They were able to get to shore. We're told they were failing. They were in serious trouble, Mark writes, rowing hard and struggling against the wind and the waves. And you know, this can happen to us as well in our lives. We can find ourselves in a situation where we are over our heads, or a situation where we are lost in fear and we are struggling and we are struggling. We are expelling so much time and so much energy, yet we still fail. We still sink. So instead of asking what God wants us to do when we experience these 5 signs, right, when we're afraid and when we feel like we're sinking, a more important question is, what is God doing? Right? It's not what do you want me to do, Lord? It's what are you doing? And by asking this question, I think we are more apt to trust in Him. So as I've already said, God does not want us to live in fear. And over again in Scripture, He tells us not to be afraid. And so this morning, I want to reflect on this life of faith that Jesus offers us by looking at what He did on the Sea of Galilee that day, and how Jesus can help us to find peace, calm, and hope in the midst of our fears and in the midst of our storms. So number 1, when the storms of life rage against us and when we are afraid, we can have faith because Jesus is already praying for us. Jesus is already praying for us. Sometimes the storms of life are consequences of our own bad decisions, right? And I think we could all list some examples of a storm in our life that was a result of just a bad decision or a bad choice, right? When we do what God doesn't want us to do, when we go against His word, we can experience all kinds of trouble. But other times, like that night on the Sea of Galilee, the storm comes out of nowhere. Right? Even when we've done all the right things, even when we've tried to be faithful. And why is that? Well, it's because so much of life, at the end of the day, is beyond our control. Right? We can be easily blindsided by life. A storm moves in seemingly out of nowhere, and we didn't even see it coming. This is often the case in health crises. Right? One minute you're feeling great, and the next minute the doctor says there's a spot on the x-ray. I think this is one of the great lessons of the book of Job. Right? Scripture tells us that Job was a blameless man, an upright man, a faithful man. He had everything. But over a period of a couple of days, he loses everything. He loses his family, his wealth, his property, even his reputation in the blink of an eye. One minute it was sunny skies, and the next it was the worst storm of his life. Now, obviously, we could do a whole series on the book of Job, and maybe that's a good idea, but I want to move on from that point. But all that is to say that lost in his anguish and caught in the midst of that storm, Job cries out, "God has blocked my way and plunged my path into darkness." God has blocked my way and plunged my path into darkness. And maybe you have felt that way before, right? Through no fault of your own. A storm has come out of nowhere, and you feel like God has blocked your way, brought you to darkness. If you've ever experienced that before, I want you to listen very carefully. Right? God always wants what is best for us. And yes, God sometimes blocks our way, but he blocks our way to protect us. He blocks our way because he has something better for us. God never blocks our way in order to harm us. That's not the God who we worship. But at the same time, we also need to accept that our ways are not God's ways. And there are some storms that come into our life that we will never understand this side of heaven. When we are caught in a storm, when we are lost in fear, we can either spend all of our time and energy trying to understand, right? Trying to find answers to the whys and the hows, or we can simply remember that God is faithful. Mark 6:46 reads, "After saying goodbye to them, Jesus went up a mountain to pray." Now, we don't know what Jesus was praying for, but I suspect that his prayers would have included his disciples. Right? At some point, he would have offered prayers for the people that God had entrusted to him. Right? God is omniscient. That means he's all-knowing. God is omnipresent. It means he is everywhere. And God is omnipotent. It means he is all-powerful. Right? God is timeless, eternal, and unchanging. God knows our past, our present, our future, all at once. God knows what is going to happen in our lives long before it happens. God is never surprised. He's never blindsided or caught off guard. Speaking to Peter about how he would deny him 3 times, Jesus says in Luke chapter 22, he says, "But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith will not fail. So when you recover, strengthen the other disciples." Right? Jesus knew about Peter's storm and subsequent fear before it even came. He already knew the outcome. He knew that Peter would fail. But he also knew that Peter would recover. The same is true for us. Right? Jesus knows our storms long before they hit, and he knows our fears, and he's already interceding in the face of that fear that we would have faith to endure. The book of Hebrews puts it this way, Hebrews 7. "Therefore he is able, once and forever, to save those who come to God through him. He lives forever to intercede with God on their behalf." Right? Jesus lives forever to intercede with God on your behalf. Right? It's wonderful to know that people are praying for us. I've experienced the power of prayer many times in my life, but I have to say, nothing compares to the prayers that Jesus, the great intercessor, Jesus, our mediator and our advocate, prays for us. Right? We want to get him on our prayer chain. When you are lost in a storm, when you feel like you're sinking, when you're afraid and all hope seems lost, remember these words from Romans 8. Who condemns us? Not Jesus Christ, who died and then was raised back to life and is now at the right side of God, interceding for us. No matter what is happening, No matter what your fears, Jesus is already praying. Number 2, when the storms of life rage against us and we are afraid, we can have faith because Jesus sees our struggle. He sees our struggle. Verse 48 reads, Jesus saw the disciples straining at the oars. So the disciples were so afraid that they didn't realize that Jesus was aware of their problem. And I think the same can be true for us, right? When we're struggling through a storm, our fear can blind us. It can blind us to God's presence, and we can think He's not there. Or we can think He doesn't care. But the reality is nothing escapes God's attention. As we read in Job 31:4, He sees everything I do and counts every step I take. And not only does Jesus see everything, not only does He know when we're in the midst of a storm, He sympathizes with us. He sympathizes with us. Hebrews 4:15, Jesus is able to sympathize with our weaknesses. Right? Jesus can sympathize with our storms because He went through them Himself. Jesus knows what it's like to be tired, frustrated, angry, sad, afraid. He knows what it's like to lose a loved one, to be criticized. He knows what it's like to experience temptation and pain and suffering and loss. And because Jesus knows, He can sympathize with us. When you are lost in a storm, and when you feel like you're sinking, when you're afraid and all hope seems lost, remember these words from Psalm 139. O Lord, you have examined my heart, and you know everything about me. You know when I sit down and stand up. You know my thoughts even when I'm far away. You see me when I travel and when I rest at home. You know everything I do. You know what I'm going to say even before I say it, Lord. You go before me and follow me. You place your hand of blessing on my head. No matter what's happening, no matter what our fears, Jesus sees our struggle. Number 3, when the storms of life rage against us and when we are afraid, we can have faith because Jesus comes to us in our moment of desperation. Right? Jesus comes to us in our moment of desperation. Again, verse 48, about 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came towards them walking on the water. Now, as I've already said, Bethsaida was only 2 hours up the shoreline. The disciples should have been there 7 hours ago, but they were way off course, fighting that storm for hours. Have you ever had a storm come into your life and blow you way off course? Right, this was the path that you thought you were on, and all of a sudden you end up over here on this path? Maybe you're off course right now, tossed about by a situation beyond your control. And like the disciples, you're exhausted and frustrated and afraid. But the good news is, when we find ourselves in that place, it's in our moment of desperation. It's when we come to the end of ourselves, when we're ready to give up, when all hope seems lost, that Jesus comes to us. Not even the water, the wind and the waves would keep the Lord from coming to His disciples. And notice He doesn't say, hey guys, I'm over here. Come on over. Right? He goes out to meet them. He meets them exactly where they're at. He enters right into the center of their storm. Right? He doesn't stand on the safety of the shoreline and shout out instructions. Try leaning to the left. Right? We don't need advice when we're afraid or in a storm. We need a miracle. We need God. And what I love about this, notice what Jesus is walking on. He's walking on the whitecaps and the waves. Right? Jesus often comes to us walking on the very thing that we're afraid of. He comes to us walking on the very thing that is threatening to overwhelm us. And he does that because he is infinitely greater than the wind and the waves. He is infinitely greater than any storm that can come into our lives. Jesus can come walking into your life on cancer. And Jesus can come walking into your life on marital breakdown, on financial trouble, on whatever. That's how he gets in. One preacher put it this way, I love it. Whatever is over our heads is under Jesus' feet. Right? That's where the wind and the waves were. They were over the disciples' heads, but they were under his feet. Whatever is over our heads is under Jesus' feet, and nothing is impossible for him. That's what the gospel is all about. Right? God coming to us in the person of Jesus in the midst of the storm, in our pain and suffering, in our fear and anxiety, in our sin and despair. He's right there in the middle of it. You can't get any more down and dirty than a stable. And that's where God chose to enter the world. When you're lost in a storm, when you feel like you're sinking, when you're afraid and all hope seems lost, remember these words from John 14:18. Jesus says, I will not abandon you or leave you as orphans in the storm. I will come to you. I will not abandon you or leave you as orphans in the storm. I will come to you. No matter what's happening, no matter what our fears, Jesus comes to us in our moment of desperation. And finally, number 4, when the storms of life rage against us, we can have faith because Jesus shows us that he is more than able. He's more than able. Verses 49 to 50 read, when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It is a ghost, they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. I love that. Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. In calling out to the disciples, Jesus gives them 3 things, 3 gifts really, in the midst of the storm. First of all, he gives them reassurance. Reassurance. He says, take courage. Secondly, he gives them a challenge. He says, don't be afraid. And finally, he gives them a revelation. He says, it is I. Now, we can miss the power behind that last one if we don't know the original Greek. It is I. The original Greek here is ego ima. Ego means I, and ima means am. So Jesus is actually saying, take courage, don't be afraid, I am. Now, as soon as we hear that, right, our spidey senses should be tingling and our flags should be raised and our lights should be going off because the name I am is the name that God gave for himself when Moses asked, who should I say has sent me? And God said to Moses, you tell Pharaoh that I am has sent you. I am is the divine name. In Hebrew, 4 letters, Yud-He, Vav-He. It is the divine name of God. It is a name that God chose for himself in the Old Testament. By walking on water, by referring to himself as I am, Jesus is revealing to his disciples who he truly is. And in fact, if you were to read all 4 Gospels today when you get home, and I dare you to do it, it's a rainy day, what else are you going to do? If you were to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you would see that Jesus uses that divine name, I am, 17 times to identify himself. He says, I am the bread of life. I am the good shepherd. I am the light of the world. I am the way, the truth, the life. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the gate, and so on and so on. In fact, when he was arrested, they said, we're looking for Jesus, and he said, I am. And what happened? The soldiers fell backwards because of the power of that name. Each time, Jesus is claiming to be far more than just a wise prophet, a good teacher. He is claiming to be the Son of God, and as such, he is more than able to help us in our time of need. I mean, think about it. Why would we want to follow Jesus? Why would we want to be Christian? Why would we want to call him Lord if he was just a person like me? Right? If he's just a wise teacher or, a good moral guy, a philosopher in the line of Buddha or whatever, if that's all Jesus is, then I'd rather stay in bed today and follow something else. But Jesus didn't say that's who he was. Right? Jesus was very clear who he was. Notice how the story ends. Verse 51 reads, "Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased." Now, in some versions of this story, and indeed earlier in Mark, there's another storm story, and Jesus speaks to the wind. He commands it to be still. Here, he doesn't even speak to it. He just gets into the boat, and the wind ceases. Jesus' very presence with the disciples calmed the wind and the waves. And Jesus' very presence with us is more than able to calm the storms in our life. Right? When you're lost in a storm, when you feel like you're sinking, when you're afraid and all hope seems lost, remember these words from Colossians 1:15. Paul says, "We look at this sun and see the God who cannot be seen. For everything, absolutely everything, above and below, visible and invisible, rank after rank after rank of angels, everything got started in him and finds its purpose in him. He was there before any of it came into existence, and he holds it all together right up to this moment." Right? It's Jesus is what's holding us together right up to this moment. No matter what's happening, no matter what our fears, Jesus shows us that he's more than able. So as I've said at the end of each of these sermons in this series, the resurrection of Jesus is central to our faith. Right? Preacher John Stott writes, "Christianity is, in its very essence, a resurrection religion. The concept of resurrection lies at its heart. If you remove it, Christianity is destroyed." I believe the risen Jesus stands in our midst this morning. He might be right over there between Kate and Wayne. Just wait there. Maybe he's farther back with Hugh Chan in the back there. But he's here. And he's in our midst. I think it's more theologically correct to say he's everywhere. But anyway, he's here. He's in our midst. And this is what he's saying to us. He's saying, "Take heart. It is I am. Do not be afraid. I have come to give you a life of faith." Now, we can all relate to the disciples on the Sea of Galilee that morning. We all know what it feels like to be afraid, to be overwhelmed by a storm, to feel like we're sinking. And fear may be an unfortunate reality of our human existence, but this story reminds us that we're not alone. Right? In the midst of our fear, in the midst of our storm, we can have faith. Because Jesus is already interceding for us. Jesus sees our struggle. He comes to us at just the right moment, and he's more than able. And in doing so, he promises to calm the wind and the waves and to bring us peace. The storms of life are unavoidable. They come out of nowhere, without warning. But with Jesus in our boat, we don't need to be afraid. Because even though we might get tossed around, even though our hair might get blown out of place, we might get a little wet, we will not sink and we will not perish. Because Jesus is alive, we can have faith instead of fear. Because no matter what our trials and challenges, no matter what the storm, nothing is too big for our God. Nothing. Absolutely nothing is too big for our God. Amen.